A word that I use a lot when I talk about training is the word integration. And I thought I would take the opportunity to explain what that means on a broad scale and also how it applies specifically to my coaching philosophy. So the term integration simply means this concept that everything is connected. This applies to politics, economics, psychology, nutrition, medicine, physics, strength and conditioning, and just about every other human endeavor you can think of. And what we find is as we move from an isolated approach to a more integrated approach, we get better results and better understanding. Now there are a few problems with integration. The first one being that human beings just simply aren't built for it. We're not very good at assessing reality in objective terms. We much prefer isolation. It makes things easier to understand, it makes information easier to chunk up. We like being able to put things into very distinct categories, but we pay the price for that in all of those fields that I just mentioned. By putting things in categories, we tend to exaggerate the differences between those categories without appreciating that everything exists on a spectrum. Physics is host to a few great examples. We used to have two forces, electricity and magnetism, but they're in fact the same force, just operating in different contexts. My preferred one is the fact that space and time, these two clearly distinct constructs, are actually part of one continuum. And that one's especially powerful because it is so counterintuitive to say that space and time are essentially the same thing. But that just highlights my point of how ineffective the human mind is at understanding reality as it exists. In terms of strength and conditioning, we've got hundreds of examples where we have isolated concepts in order to label them and understand them, when actually integration is the reality of what's happening. So some quick examples: if we talk energy systems, we often talk about aerobic, anaerobic and alactic training as if you're just targeting one of those at a time. You're never targeting one energy system, you're always using all three, just in different ratios. The next one is strength. There are many, many different ways of expressing strength. To say that to be as fast as Usain Bolt doesn't require an enormous amount of strength would be completely false. Even though we associate strength with lifting maximal weight and a very slow grinding quality, strength just exists on a spectrum like everything else. And one end is speed, and one end is shifting a load of weight. It's all strength in different contexts. For me, I'm a biomechanics guy, so I believe that biomechanics comes first and foremost in people's training and arguably in people's health. It's going to affect your breathing, it's going to affect your mindset via your nervous system, it's going to affect your digestion. All of these things are affected by biomechanics. If we talk about throwing as a fundamental skill, we know that you cannot simply train all the muscles involved. You can't train the obliques, the pecs, the rotator cuff, the bicep, the tricep in isolation and put that back into a credible, competent movement pattern. And we know this because we've got a fantastic data set that proves it. If isolation worked in terms of training movement patterns, bodybuilders would be the best athletes in every single field of human endeavor. They would dominate everything because they've trained every single muscle to a very extreme extent, but what they can't do is put it back into a full integrated movement pattern. Another example of this that we might be familiar with is if you go to the driving range, and if we think about strength as just this expression of force and brute power, then what we know is that, well, what we think we know is that if we hit that ball as hard as we can, it'll go further. That doesn't tend to work out on the driving range. You tend to either miss the ball or you slice it, or when you do connect, it just seems to rattle up through your hands and you don't cleanly connect with the ball. And then you relax and take a nice smooth swing, and suddenly that thing is sailing through the air, and you've put somehow way more force by relaxing. And a lot of that is because you have created an integrated movement pattern that is centered around efficiency. If there's one thing missing from most modern training methods, it's efficiency. We often just train to endure fatigue rather than to reduce it entirely. And if we can integrate properly, then what we find is we can generate a lot of free energy. So there are some great experiments done with sprinters where you can do thermic analyses and measure exactly how much oxygen should be required to fuel the amount of movement that takes place. You can measure that and calculate it. And then in reality, what actually happens is that sprinters take up about half of the amount that we'd expect. And that is because the integrated relationship between muscles and tendons creates a lot of free elastic recoil, which means that we can be much more efficient and use less energy to create the same amount of work. So in terms of my coaching, when I meet a new client, at some stage they're going to do some kind of postural analysis. And that is because posture is just an expression of muscular integration in a really, really simple situation. You'll never find someone with an isolated postural dysfunction. It simply can't happen. I defy you to be able to round your back into a kyphotic position without shortening your pecs and crushing your anterior chest wall. It's just impossible. Same thing with an anterior pelvic tilt. If you tilt your hips forwards, to be able to do so without arching your back is nearly impossible. And what we can see is that when the pelvic tilts forwards and the lumbar spine curves, the thoracic has to round to compensate. That's going to affect your ability to use your upper body musculature. Your shoulders might start hurting. You might affect your breathing pattern because you simply can't inhale into here. You might then get headaches because you're hyperextending your neck. All of this might be coming from an improperly positioned pelvis, and that's why we need to take an integrated approach to posture and to movement. Now here's the real problem when it comes to evidence-based practitioners, is that the moment you're dealing with an integrated system, there are too many variables to account for, and your ability to do accurate science or draw confident conclusions goes down to basically zero. We like to do randomized controlled trials that prove that A causes B. Simple. It never works like that in reality. What usually happens is a cascade of events. A means that B stops producing C, which causes D to produce more E, which results in F. That's how things typically work in the body and in every single integrated system you can think of. The difficulty here is that then people can extrapolate, you can get bro science, or people might miss out parts of that mechanism. They might forget that halfway through that cycle, if we turn off C, then Z comes in and means that D does something completely different. And understanding all of those variables is impossible. So when I talk about integration, it certainly doesn't mean that I'm right, that I've got all the answers. It doesn't mean that at all. But also, equally, we need to understand that just because the science doesn't say that A is important for F, just because directly that link isn't there, it doesn't mean it's unimportant. This is why I can be quite confident in saying something relatively controversial like improving your biomechanics can improve your immune system. It's not because correcting your anterior pelvic tilt is going to produce more white blood cells. It's not that straightforward. What it means is you're going to cause a positive cascade of effects that can apply to the body in many, many different situations, eventually down the line. Just because the science doesn't establish that direct link doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but equally just because I say it does also doesn't mean that it exists. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that when we apply science to integrated systems, the conclusions have to be quite soft. We also have to be aware that integration is the path towards the right answer. Good can be the enemy of best, and if we're looking for things that are right or wrong, that's an isolated approach to an integrated question, and we need to appreciate that right and wrong is a spectrum in itself, and if we're moving towards integration, we're heading in the right direction.